The sound that ruled Elena's nights was not a gentle rumble. It was a violent, seismic event, a guttural roaring that seemed to shake the very walls of their suburban home. For nearly a decade, her husband Mark's snoring had been the soundtrack to her exhaustion. What had begun years ago as a low, manageable growl had mutated over time into a nightly performance of such staggering volume that it defied all logic. It was a wet, choking, gasping noise that sounded less like a man sleeping and more like a large animal fighting for its life. Their friends joked about it. Mark himself treated it as a running gag, a quirky, masculine flaw, like leaving the toilet seat up or refusing to ask for directions. But for Elena, who lay awake beside it night after night, it was a form of slow, insidious torture. Mark, at 48, was a man in stubborn denial. A high school football coach, his identity was built on an old-school image of strength and invincibility. He was loud, charismatic, and constitutionally incapable of admitting weakness. In his mind, doctors were for broken bones and visible bleeding, not for something as trivial as snoring. "I'm just a deep sleeper, Elle," he'd say with a dismissive wave of his hand, his voice raspy in the morning. "It's what real men do. You're just too sensitive." But Elena knew it was more than that. She would lie in the dark, a silent, resentful witness to the nightly battle. She would watch his entire body tense with the effort of breathing. She saw the way his chest would heave, fighting to draw air through a blockage she couldn't see. Their nights had become a sad, familiar ritual. She would try to fall asleep first, a desperate race against the clock before the first rumblings began. Once the snoring started, she would begin her campaign of futile defenses. She would nudge him, a gentle push on his shoulder. "Mark, Mark, roll over." He would grunt, shift his weight, and the noise would momentarily subside, only to return with a vengeance moments later. Then came the more aggressive prods, a sharp jab in his ribs that would make him snort and partially wake, glaring at her in the darkness. "What? I'm just sleeping," he'd protest, before falling back into the same suffocating rhythm. Most nights, around 2 in the morning, she would give up. Defeated, she would grab her pillow and blanket and make the lonely migration to the living room couch. The couch was lumpy, too short, and offered little real rest, but its silence was a sanctuary. It was there, in the cold, blue light of the moonlit living room, that her frustration would fester. This wasn't just about her sleep, it was about him. He was 48, overweight, and refused to acknowledge that his body was sending out distress signals. He was tired all the time, falling asleep in his armchair the moment he sat down. He was irritable, suffering from headaches, classic signs of sleep deprivation she'd read about on medical websites. She pleaded with him, argued, and begged. "Please, just do a sleep study. It could be sleep apnea. It's dangerous, Mark." But he would not be moved. He saw it as an attack on his vitality, an accusation of being flawed. As the years wore on, the sound changed again. It became wetter, more desperate. There were new, terrifying pauses, long, silent stretches where the roaring would stop completely. The first time it happened, Elena had felt a brief, blessed moment of relief, thinking he had finally settled. But the silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10, 15. A dead, terrifying stillness. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding, every nerve ending screaming. She was about to shake him, to call 911, when he would suddenly erupt with a violent, choking gasp that sounded like a man being brought back from the dead. He would snort, clear his throat, and the monstrous snoring would resume as if nothing had happened. He was suffocating. Night after night, he was suffocating, and he was completely unaware. The joke had long since worn thin. Elena was no longer just an annoyed, sleep-deprived wife. She was a terrified witness to a slow-motion catastrophe she was powerless to stop. The breaking point was not the nightly gasping for air, but a quiet, terrifying moment on a sunny afternoon. Mark, a man who prided himself on his sharp reflexes and control, was driving home from a long, grueling practice. Elena was in the passenger seat, reading off their grocery list. The road was straight, the traffic light. She was in the middle of a sentence about needing milk when the car suddenly, silently, began to drift. "Mark," she said, her voice calm. No response. "Mark," she repeated, louder, looking up from her list. He was bolt upright, his hands on the wheel, but but his eyes were closed, his head lolling slightly to the side. He was fast asleep, hurtling toward a busy intersection at 40 miles per hour. "Mark!" Elena screamed, a sound of pure, primal terror. She grabbed the wheel, yanking it hard to the right as he simultaneously woke with a violent, snorting gasp, his foot slamming on the brake. The car screeched to a halt on the gravel shoulder, mere yards from a telephone pole. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the engine and their own ragged, panicked breathing. Mark was pale, his hands shaking on the wheel, his eyes wide with a new, unfamiliar emotion, fear. His invincibility had just been shattered. He couldn't deny this. He couldn't joke about this. He had almost killed them both. That night, there were no arguments, no pleas. Elena sat him down at the kitchen table, her face a mask of cold, hard resolve. "This is over, Mark," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "This is not snoring. This is not you being a deep sleeper. You are a danger to yourself and to me. You fell asleep driving. You stopped breathing every night. I am not going to be a widow because you're too proud to see a doctor." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "You have an appointment with an ENT, Dr. Harrison, tomorrow at 3 p.m. I've already called your school and told them you have a medical emergency. You are going. This is not a request." Mark looked at her, at the woman he loved, and saw not an overly sensitive wife, but a terrified, resolute stranger. The fight had gone out of him. He simply, quietly nodded. "Okay," he whispered. The doctor's office was sterile and quiet, a stark contrast to the noisy, chaotic world of a football field. Dr. Harrison was a kind, methodical man in his 50s. He listened patiently as Elena, not Mark, described the situation. She described the volume, the choking, the gasping, the terrifying silences, and finally, the incident in the car. Mark sat silently, staring at his hands, the picture of a humbled man. Dr. Harrison nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Well, Mark, it certainly sounds like a severe case of obstructive sleep apnea," he said, his tone professional. "But the choking and the sheer volume Elena describes. Let's take a look inside." The initial examination was routine. Dr. Harrison checked Mark's nose and sinuses. Then, he took a tongue depressor. "Okay, open up and say ah." Mark complied. The doctor peered into his throat, a small frown line appearing between his brows. He murmured. "A little red, tonsils are normal. But your soft palate looks a bit crowded. Let's get a better view." He prepared a flexible nasendoscope, a thin, camera-tipped tube that would go through Mark's nose and down into his throat. "This will be a little uncomfortable, just for a moment." As the camera fed its image to the monitor on the wall, Elena watched, her stomach in knots. At first, it was just a blur of pink tissue. But as the doctor guided the scope deeper, past the back of the tongue and toward the larynx, all three of them saw it. Dr. Harrison's hand froze. Elena let out a small, stifled gasp and grabbed Mark's arm. It was not a crowded palate. It was not swollen tissue. Hanging down from the side of Mark's throat, partially obscuring his airway, was a large, pale, bulbous mass. It was the size of a large grape, with a strange, pebbled texture. It looked alien, a foreign, fleshy growth that had no business being there. "My God," Dr. Harrison whispered, his clinical detachment evaporating, replaced by a look of profound concern. "Mark, that is not sleep apnea. You have a very large mass in your oropharynx. And from the look of it, it's almost completely blocking your airway when you lie down." He turned to them, his eyes grave. "This isn't just causing snoring. This is slowly, methodically suffocating you. We need to get a CT scan." Immediately, the word mass echoed in the sterile examination room, instantly changing the entire context of their lives. What had been a domestic annoyance, a source of marital friction and fatigue, was now a life-and-death medical crisis. Mark, who had walked into the clinic a stubborn man in denial, now looked pale and terrified. The bravado had vanished, replaced by the raw, silent fear of a man confronting his own mortality. The short walk from the ENT's office to the hospital's radiology department felt like a mile-long trek into the unknown. Elena held Mark's hand, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her grip was firm. A silent promise that he was no longer facing this alone. The CT scanner was a large, humming white donut that felt both futuristic and profoundly intimidating. Mark lay flat on his back on the narrow gurney, the position he so dreaded at night. As the machine began its work, the gurney slid slowly backward into the humming ring. He was instructed to hold his breath, and in that forced stillness, a terrifying thought struck him. This was the silence Elena had described. This was the moment before the gasping, the moment of pure, terrifying suffocation. For the first time, he fully comprehended the horror she had been witnessing for years. He was alone inside the machine, with only the rhythmic, mechanical noises and the sudden, chilling realization of what had been happening to his body every single night. They didn't have to wait long. Dr. Harrison had marked the scan as stat, and the urgency of the situation meant they were ushered back into a consultation room within an hour. The doctor entered the room, his face grim. He didn't sit down. He immediately pulled up the CT images on a large, glowing monitor on the wall. The screen showed a cross-section of Mark's throat, a detailed map of his internal anatomy in stark black and white. And there, unmistakable and horrifying, was the mass. It was far, far larger than the endoscope had suggested. It was a massive, globular, and terrifyingly complex-looking tumor. Mark, Elena, this is more serious than I anticipated, Dr. Harrison began, his voice low and heavy. He used a digital pen to circle the object on the screen. The mass, as you can see here, is enormous. It's approximately the size of a golf ball, maybe slightly larger. He traced its origins. It appears to be growing from a thick stalk attached to the side of his oropharynx, right near the base of his tongue. He clicked to another image, a side view, which was even more terrifying. When you are awake and standing, your muscles hold your airway open, and the mass sits to the side. The moment you lie down and those muscles relax, this thing is falling backward like a perfect, fleshy cork, completely and totally occluding your airway. It's not obstructing your breathing, Mark. It's stopping it. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She reached for Mark's hand, which was cold as ice. Is it cancer? She whispered, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. Dr. Harrison's expression softened slightly. The edges look smooth, and it appears to be a single, contained mass, which are good signs. It has the visual characteristics of a large, benign tumor, perhaps a rare fibroma or a massive papilloma. But at this size, its benign nature is almost irrelevant. It is, as we've seen, mechanically lethal. This mass is killing you. The doctor's next words erased any small comfort they might have felt. The problem, he said, is its location. It's wedged deep in the throat, surrounded by a critical network of nerves and major blood vessels. The carotid artery, the jugular vein, the vagus nerve. Removing something of this size from this area is an incredibly high-risk surgery. It's not like taking out a tonsil. He explained that a traditional external approach would mean cutting through the neck, a disfiguring and dangerous procedure. A transoral, through the mouth, approach would be a blind, bloody battle in a cramped space, with a high risk of catastrophic bleeding. Frankly, Dr. Harrison said with a heavy sigh, this is one of the most challenging surgical cases I've seen. We have to get it out. If he has one bad night, if he gets a cold or any additional swelling, he will simply stop breathing and not wake up. But the surgery to remove it, it is fraught with danger. The final, unspoken question hung in the air. What if the cure was just as deadly as the disease? Asterisk. The night before the surgery was a special kind of hell. Mark was admitted to the hospital and forced to sleep in a reclining chair in a brightly lit room, hooked up to a machine that would sound an alarm if his oxygen levels dropped. He couldn't lie flat. It was simply too dangerous. Elena sat in a visitor's chair beside him, her heart leaping into her throat at every cough, every splutter, every slight change in his breathing. Sleep was impossible for her. She just watched him, her mind replaying a decade of her own frustration, now reframed as a decade of terrifying near misses. She had been angry at him for snoring, when in reality, she should have been terrified that he was suffocating. Mark himself was uncharacteristically silent, his bravado completely stripped away. He was a man facing a mortal gamble, and the bravado that had served him so well on the football field was useless here. The lead surgeon assigned to his case was Dr. Thorne, a renowned specialist in complex, minimally invasive head and neck surgeries. He was a man with an intense, focused energy and hands that were famously steady. He met with Mark and Elena in the early morning light, his confidence a small island of calm in their sea of terror. "Mark, Elena," he began, his voice crisp, "I'm not going to lie to you. This is a very complex piece of anatomy. The mass is large, and it is surrounded by the carotid artery, the jugular vein, and the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves. 1 millimeter of error in any direction has life-altering consequences." He pointed to the CT scan, now a familiar, horrifying image. "However, a traditional open-neck surgery is, in my opinion, unacceptably destructive. We're going to do this from the inside." He explained the plan, a TORS, or transoral robotic surgery. He would sit at a console across the room, controlling two delicate, precise robotic arms that would go through Mark's mouth. "The robot's camera gives me a high-definition, 3D, magnified view," he said. "Its arms can move in ways my hands cannot, with zero tremor. Our goal is to find the stalk of this mass, cauterize its blood supply, and dissect it free from your throat, millimeter by millimeter, pulling the entire thing out through your mouth. It's difficult, it's high risk, but it's the best chance we have to remove it cleanly and get you back to your life." Mark, putting all his faith in this man's steady hands, simply nodded. "Do it." The wait was agonizing. Elena sat in the surgical waiting room, a cup of untouched, cold coffee in her hands, staring at a digital board that tracked Mark's progress. "In surgery" flashed in green next to his name, a status that felt both hopeful and terrifying. In the operating room, Mark was deep under anesthesia. Dr. Thorne was at his console, his eyes pressed to the 3D viewer, his hands deftly manipulating the robotic controls. On the screen before him, the mass was vividly clear, a huge, pale, fleshy orb, glistening under the camera's light. It was even larger than the CT had suggested. "Okay," Dr. Thorne said to his team. "Let's begin the dissection. Cautery on." He started at the base, where the mass seemed to join the pharyngeal wall. He meticulously burned and cut the surface tissues, but something was immediately wrong. The tissue texture wasn't right. It wasn't the uniform, fibrous tissue of a fibroma, nor the lumpy, irregular tissue of a papilloma. This felt different. It was tougher, almost like a capsule. "This isn't a simple tumor," he muttered, his concentration deepening. "The density is anomalous." He decided to change tactics. Before trying to cut the entire stalk, he needed to know what was inside. He repositioned the robotic arm, switched to a cutting tool, and made a small, exploratory incision directly into the center of the mass itself. What happened next made every person in the operating room gasp. The mass was not made of solid tissue. It was a hollow, incredibly thick-walled sac. The moment he punctured it, a small amount of thick, dark, non-human fluid seeped out. But inside was something else. It was hard. Dr. Thorne used the robotic graspers to widen the opening, and the camera appeared inside the hollow orb. Nestled in the center was a small, dark object. It was hard, perfectly smooth, and had a strange, geometric shape. It was not biological. What in God's name? The assisting surgeon whispered to Dr. Thorne's mind was racing. This wasn't a tumor. It wasn't cancer. This was a pseudotumor. A 1 in a million, chronic granulomatous reaction. This was a fortress built by Mark's own immune system over decades around a foreign object. He realized with a jolt of absolute certainty, Mark hadn't grown this. He had inhaled it, probably as a small child. An object so small it didn't choke him, but so large it couldn't pass, lodging itself in the soft tissue of his pharynx. For 40 years, his body had been trying to wall it off, adding layer upon layer of scar tissue, slowly, year by year, until it had built this massive, fleshy tomb that was now, finally, suffocating him. The snoring was the sound of air vibrating against a plastic toy from his childhood. "Change of plan," Dr. Thorne commanded, his voice electric with discovery. "We're not dissecting the sac. The sac is his own tissue. We're just performing an extraction." He navigated the robotic arms back inside the fleshy cavity, carefully grasping the small, hard object. He pulled it free from the sac that had been its home for 40 years. He retracted the arms, bringing the object out through Mark's mouth. He dropped it onto a sterile blue cloth. The team stared. It was a small, red, plastic game piece. A hotel from a 1980s Monopoly set. The thing that had been slowly killing him, the source of a decade of misery, was a piece of a board game he'd likely swallowed before he even knew how to read. The room was silent, the team frozen in shared, utter disbelief. Asterisk. A wave of stunned, almost hysterical, relief washed over the operating room. The tension that had been thick enough to cut with a scalpel instantly evaporated, replaced by the giddy, disbelieving whispers of the surgical team. A Monopoly piece? One nurse muttered, her eyes wide above her mask. He's been choking on a hotel for 40 years? Dr. Thorne himself let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure, astonished triumph. The discovery had fundamentally altered the entire nature of the surgery. What they had feared was a malignant, invasive tumor, rooted in the critical structures of the neck, was, in fact, a benign, self-contained pseudotumor, a fortress of scar tissue built by the body's own defense mechanisms. The mass was not part of the vital nerves and arteries. It was simply pushing against them. This realization turned an impossibly delicate dissection into a straightforward, if still complex, removal. It's a foreign body granuloma, Dr. Thorne announced to the room, his voice electric with the joy of solving an impossible puzzle. It's just an incredibly large, old one. The blood supply is self-contained. It's not entangled. We just need to free the capsule. With the robotic arms, he no longer had to painstakingly shave away tissue millimeter by millimeter, terrified of hitting a nerve. Instead, he could confidently work around the massive sac, freeing it from the surrounding pharyngeal wall. He found the thick, fibrous stalk of scar tissue that had anchored it for decades, cauterized its blood supply, and, in a single, definitive move, severed it. The entire golf ball-sized mass was now free. The team skillfully extracted it through Mark's mouth, a procedure that was both medically delicate and profoundly bizarre. The airway, which for years had been a tiny, compromised slit, was now wide open and clear. The source of a decade of misery, the monster in the dark, was gone. Dr. Thorne walked into the waiting room, his surgical cap in his hand. Elena shot to her feet, her heart seizing, bracing for a verdict. She had been watching the clock, and the surgery had finished hours earlier than she'd been told to expect. A surgeon finishing early could only mean one of two things: a miracle or a catastrophe. The doctor's face, however, was not one of grief. It was one of profound, weary, and almost amused relief. "Elena," he said, and his smile was the first real breath she had taken all day. "Mark is in recovery. The surgery was a complete success. The mass is 100% removed. His airway is completely clear." Elena collapsed back into her chair, a tidal wave of relief so powerful it left her momentarily dizzy. She wept, deep, racking sobs of gratitude. "The tumor," she managed to say. "Was it?" "It wasn't a tumor," Dr. Thorne said, sitting down across from her. He paused, trying to find the words. "What we found. It's the most remarkable case of my career. What Mark had was what we call a foreign body granuloma. His body built a massive, protective wall of scar tissue around an object, something that didn't belong there. It was like an oyster building a pearl, but in his throat." He then held up a small, clear plastic specimen jar. Inside, cleaned of its 40-year-old prison, sat the small, red plastic hotel. Elena stared at it, her brain unable to process the image. It was so small, so trivial, so absurd. "A toy. From a Monopoly set, we believe," Dr. Thorne said. "He must have inhaled or swallowed it as a very, very small child. It lodged in his pharynx, and his immune system spent the next 40 years trying to wall it off, slowly building the mass that became, as he grew, large enough to suffocate him." Elena looked from the tiny red hotel to the doctor's face, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat, mingling with her tears. All those years of fighting, all the exhaustion, all the fear. It was all because of a game piece. When Mark woke in the recovery room, the first thing he felt, before the pain in his throat, before the grogginess of the anesthesia, was air. He took a breath, and it was the deepest, clearest, most effortless breath of his entire adult life. The suffocating pressure, the feeling of a fist in his throat that had become his normal, was gone. He wept silently, a profound, instinctual relief. Later that day, Elena sat by his bed. "It's gone, Mark. You're going to be okay." The tumor," he rasped. She just shook her head, a strange smile on her face. Not a tumor. She held up the jar with the small red hotel. Mark stared at it, his anesthetic-fogged brain struggling. And then, like a photograph slowly developing in fluid, a fragmented, deeply buried memory flickered in his mind. He was 5 years old. He was on the shag carpet of his childhood living room. His older brother, Kevin, was there. He remembered putting the little red house in his mouth to hide it. Kevin making him laugh. The sudden, terrifying, silent moment of choking. He remembered his mother, screaming, grabbing him, turning him upside down and hitting his back. He had coughed, sputtered, and a piece of candy he'd eaten earlier had flown out. They all thought the danger was over. They thought that was what he had choked on. But the hotel had stayed. For 43 years, it had stayed. The first night Mark spent back in his own bed was the most profound of their marriage. Elena lay awake, as she always had. But this time, she was kept awake by the overwhelming, beautiful, and absolutely perfect silence. There was no roaring, no gasping, no choking. There was only the sound of her husband beside her, breathing. Just the quiet, gentle, rhythmic sound of a man sleeping peacefully. She listened to that sound until the sun came up, tears of gratitude streaming silently down her face. Mark's life was transformed. The chronic exhaustion that had defined his existence melted away. His headaches vanished. His energy returned. He was no longer the grumpy, tired coach, but the vibrant, happy man she had married. The little red hotel now sits on their mantelpiece, a bizarre trophy from a 43-year-long battle he never knew he was fighting. It is a constant, absurd reminder that the most trivial, forgotten moments of our childhood can grow into monsters, and that sometimes the thing we dismiss as a simple human flaw is, in fact, the sound of a secret, desperately trying to be heard before it silences us forever.